Ottertail Cutover, Minnesota, October 1901. The air smelled of pine resin and the coming cold. Along the rutted track that passed for a county road, the skeletons of harvested fields stood stark against a low, gray sky. Here, where the great northern woods had been clear-cut, leaving a landscape of stumps and struggling new growth, men built with a kind of desperate speed against the looming hammer of a Minnesota winter. They built what they knew: single-story log cabins, chinked with mud and moss, solid and low to the ground, all except one. On a slight rise overlooking a shallow creek, Torvald Kjelsberg was building something that made no sense. He was a quiet man, broad in the shoulders, with pale blue eyes that seemed to be perpetually fixed on a distant horizon. His project was not low to the ground. It was tall, 2 stories tall. The ground floor was a massive affair of heavy-set timbers, 20 feet wide and 36 feet long, with wide doors and few windows. It looked for all the world like a sturdy, well-made barn, or a fjøs, as he called it in his native Norwegian. But then, inexplicably, he began framing a second story. Not a hayloft, but a proper living space, smaller than the footprint below, only 12 feet by 20. It sat perched atop the larger structure like a captain's cabin on a barge. Neighbors would stop their wagons on the track, staring. Jedediah Stone, a farmer whose land bordered Kjelsberg's to the east, shook his head, a wad of tobacco working in his jaw. "It's a house in the hayloft," he'd say to anyone who would listen. "Heat rises. Every fool knows that. He's building his fire on the second floor, and all the warmth is going to fly right out the roof. The ground floor will be a block of ice. It's pure foolishness." Silas Croft, the area's most respected carpenter, was more technical in his dismissal. "The span is too great for the joists he's using, even at 8 inches, he declared at the Mercantile in Fergus Falls. And a plank floor? A 2-inch plank floor between a barn and a house? The damp and the smell will ruin them. He'll be living in a swamp of ammonia. The man is mad." The consensus was clear. The Norwegian was building Kjelsberg's Folly. The mockery was constant but quiet, the way of frontier folk who preferred to let a man's failure speak for itself. But the criticism became official in late October. A buggy pulled up and out stepped Emmett Ranstad, the Ottertail County dairy inspector. Ranstad was a man of rules and regulations, his face set in a permanent expression of professional concern. He walked the perimeter of the structure, his boots crunching on wood shavings. He peered into the lower level, noting the stalls being framed for cattle and horses. He then looked up at the living quarters taking shape above. He approached Torvald, who was fitting a window frame on the upper level. "Mr. Kjelsberg," Ranstad called up, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I'm Emmett Ranstad, county inspector." Torvald nodded, not pausing in his work. "I'll be candid, sir," Ranstad continued, pulling a small leather-bound book from his coat. "What you're building here, it appears to be in violation of the 1899 Minnesota State Dairy Code, Section 4. You cannot house dairy stock directly beneath human living quarters. It's a matter of hygiene." Torvald stopped his hammering and looked down. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand. "The animals will be clean. The floor will be tight," he said, his English clipped and precise. "That's not the point," Ranstad said, his patience already thinning. "The code is the code. It's about preventing the transmission of disease. The air, the effluvia. It's considered unsanitary. I'll have to issue a citation. You have until April 1st to bring the structure into compliance." That means a separate barn. He wrote out the slip, weighted it with a stone near the base of the foundation, and drove away, leaving Torvald alone with the rising wind and the silent judgment of the entire county. What did this Norwegian builder from Trøndelag, a man who spoke more of long houses than log cabins. Understand about the simple, constant heat of living bodies that a county full of experienced farmers, a respected carpenter, and even a state-certified dairy inspector had missed? Before we see how this strange house-over barn fared in the coming polar vortex, a test that would pit old-world knowledge against the brutal reality of the American North, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We explore the forgotten wisdom of the past, the quiet ingenuity that allowed pioneers to survive and thrive. I promise you will learn something fundamental today about BTUs, animal husbandry, and the forgotten physics of cohabitation. When you're done, let us know in the comments. Have you ever seen a design that puts livestock and living quarters together for warmth? We'd love to hear about it. Torvald Kjelsberg was not a logger, not a wheat farmer, not a frontiersman in the American mold. He was a builder. Specifically, he was a man shaped by the deep valleys and steep mountains of Verdal, in the Trøndelag region of Norway. His hands did not know the quick work of a homesteader's shack. They knew the slow, patient craft of the Trønderlawn, the long houses of his homeland, structures built to last for centuries, not seasons. He was a man of the fjøs and the stew, of massive stall planks and thick sod roofs, of building traditions forged by 1,000 winters colder and darker than anything his new neighbors could imagine. He had arrived in Minnesota 2 years prior, with his wife Ingrid and their 2 small children, Lars and Sophia. Ingrid was a quiet, resilient woman, with hands as capable as his own, her mind full of the recipes and remedies of her own Norwegian upbringing. Lars at 6 was a shock of blonde hair and boundless energy, while 4-year-old Sophia was her father's shadow, watching his every move with solemn blue eyes. They had bought their plot in the cutover for a pittance, and like everyone else, had thrown up a standard 1-room log cabin to get them through the first winter. That winter of 1899 had been their true education. It was a cold that was not just a temperature, but a malevolent physical presence. Torvald had seen cold before, but this was different. This was a dry, invasive cold that found every crack, every weakness. It was a cold that broke things. He remembered his neighbor, a good man from Ohio, coming over one morning, his face ashen. The cast-iron bowl of his new Delaval cream separator had cracked clear across the collar on the first turn of the crank, the metal contracting so fast it tore itself apart. He remembered Ingrid trying to light a lantern, only to find the kerosene had thickened to a useless, translucent jelly inside the font. Most vividly, he remembered going to the barn to fork hay for their single, shivering cow. He drove the tines of his new steel hay fork into a frozen bale, and with a sound like a pistol shot, 2 of the tines snapped clean off, made as brittle as glass by the incredible cold. That winter, they were never truly warm. They lived in a small bubble of heat around the cast-iron stove, a bubble that shrank and grew with the fire. The corners of the cabin were thick with frost. They slept in their coats, under every blanket they owned. The children were perpetually sick with coughs. Torvald burned through a staggering amount of wood, watching the heat pour from the stovepipe into the black, indifferent sky. He felt like a man trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. All his effort, all his fuel was being lost, radiated away into the void. He vowed then that he would not face another winter like that. He would build what he knew. He would build a home that didn't fight the cold, but worked with it. The conventional failure of the standard frontier cabin was a story written in frost on 1,000,000 window panes. The problem wasn't the logs. A well-chinked log wall was a decent insulator. The problem was a fundamental misunderstanding of heat dynamics, a failure of the system as a whole. Jedediah Stone's cabin was a perfect example. It was a single story, 18 by 24 feet. with a fieldstone fireplace at one end and a small cook stove at the other. By all local standards, it was a fine, respectable home, but in a Minnesota winter, it was a thermal sieve. Its primary failure was the floor. It was built on log sleepers laid directly on the frozen ground. The floorboards were simple 1-inch planks, with small gaps between them. The immense frozen mass of the earth acted as a giant heat sink, constantly pulling warmth down and out of the cabin. No matter how hot the air in the room became, the floor remained brutally cold. Then there was the air itself. The cabin was a single large volume. The stove heated the air, which would rise to the ceiling, transfer its heat to the cold roof boards, and then sink back down as it cooled, creating a constant, drafty cycle. To stay warm, the Stone family had to live within a few feet of the stove, their faces roasting while their backs were cold. The single-pane glass windows, a mark of prosperity, were thermal holes bleeding heat at an astonishing rate. On a cold morning, they would be coated with an inch-thick layer of opaque white ice on the inside. The fuel consumption was ruinous. Jedediah, having cleared most of his land for planting, had to buy cordwood. He burned through nearly a cord a week during the coldest spells, a significant financial drain that cut directly into the meager profits from his crops. The fire demanded constant attention, a hungry beast that could never be satisfied. If it died down in the middle of the night, the temperature in the cabin would plummet to near freezing within an hour. It was an exhausting, expensive, and ultimately losing battle against the laws of physics. The men of Ottertail County saw a cabin as a fortress. Torvald Kjelsberg knew it had to be a living thing, so he built. The foundation of the fuse was heavy timber, set on stone piers that lifted it off the ground, creating a dead air space for insulation beneath. The walls were thick planked, with battens sealing the gaps. This lower level was the engine of the house. It was 20 feet wide and 36 feet long, large enough for the 4 milk cows and 2 draft horses he planned to acquire. The floor was not wood, but packed clay over a bed of gravel, designed to absorb moisture. Over this, a thick bedding of hay would be laid. The mockery intensified as the upper story took shape. Building a second floor before his roof is on, Silas Croft scoffed to a group of men. Backwards. Everything he does is backwards. Torvald ignored them, focusing on the most critical part of the entire structure, the floor of the living quarters, which was also the ceiling of the barn. He laid down heavy 8-inch joists, more than sufficient for the 12 by 20 foot span of the room above. Then came the flooring itself, not the single layer of 1-inch pine everyone else used. Torvald had sourced special 2-inch thick tongue-and-groove planks. They were expensive, costing nearly as much as all the other lumber combined. He fitted them with painstaking care, tapping each one into place, ensuring there were no gaps. This floor was the membrane between 2 worlds. It had to be perfect. It was during this phase that Emmett Ranstad paid his visit and delivered the citation. After the inspector left, Jedediah Stone ambled over from his property line. "Heard the news," he said, spitting a brown stream of juice near a pile of wood shavings. "County's got you. Told you it was no good, mixing cows and kitchens." Torvald looked down from his perch on the second-story frame. He looked at Jedediah, a man who meant no real harm but was trapped in the prison of his own experience. "The code is for a cold barn," Torvald said simply. Jedediah squinted. "What's that supposed to mean?" "My barn will not be cold," Torvald replied, and turned back to his work, leaving Jedediah to scratch his head in confusion. Inside the structure, he built a staircase, a proper interior stair that led from the barn directly up into the living quarters, enclosed in its own small shaft to act as a flue for the rising warmth. Finally, he built a chimney for the small cook stove he would install upstairs. It was made of brick, a material he had paid dearly for, and it ran down through the floor, its mass extending into the barn below, designed to absorb and radiate heat on both levels. By the time the first snow flurries began to fly in early November, the Trøndelag was complete. It stood tall and strange against the landscape, its unpainted pine glowing in the weak autumn light. To his neighbors, it was a monument to one man's stubborn foolishness. To Torvald, it was an ark. The secret of the Trøndelag wasn't magic, it was math. It was a sophisticated two-part thermal engine, and Torvald Kjelsberg, though he didn't use the modern terms, understood its mechanics perfectly. The problem with a conventional cabin wasn't just heat loss, it was the lack of a constant, reliable heat source. A wood stove was a powerful point source, but it was intermittent. Torvald's design solved that problem by creating a low-grade 24-hour furnace. The furnace was the Livestock. An average dairy cow, at rest, generates approximately 3,000 British thermal units, or BTUs, of heat per hour. A horse generates slightly more. Torvald's plan called for 4 cows and 2 horses. Conservatively, this meant his 6 animals would be producing a combined total of around $18,000 to 20,000 BTUs every single hour. However, much of this heat is lost through the animals' respiration and the building's own ventilation. A more realistic figure for the sensible heat, the heat that actually warms the surrounding air and surfaces, is closer to 901,000 BTUs per animal. So, his 6 animals were a reliable, living furnace, putting out roughly 5,600 BTUs per hour into the lower level of the structure. This heat, generated continuously day and night, transformed the FJUs. In a standard, unheated Minnesota barn, the temperature would quickly drop to match the outside air. But here, the constant infusion of 5,600 BTUs per hour kept the barn's interior from freezing. Even with some ventilation to keep the air fresh, the temperature inside the barn would hover around a stable, and for the animals, comfortable 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the world outside was a polar wasteland. This was the first part of the engine. The second was the transfer of that heat to the living quarters above. Heat rises. The warm air in the barn, along with the direct body heat radiating from the animals, rose to the ceiling. That ceiling was Torvald's 2-inch thick plank floor. Wood is an insulator, but it is not a perfect one. Heat will always move through it from the warmer side to the cooler side. The rate of this transfer depends on the material, its thickness, and the temperature difference. For Torvald's thick pine floor, the transfer rate was calculated to be around 4 BTUs per hour for every square foot of surface area, given the temperature differential between the 55-degree barn and a targeted 68-degree room above. The living quarters measured 12 by 20 feet for a total floor area of 240 square feet. The math was simple and elegant. 240 square feet multiplied by a transfer rate of 4 BTUs per hour per square foot equals 960 BTUs per hour. This was the genius of the design. A constant, steady flow of nearly 1,000 BTUs per hour was rising through the floor, warming the living space from below. It was like living on top of a massive, low-temperature, radiant heating panel. Now consider the heat loss. A small, well-built cabin of that size, with minimal windows and a solid roof, would lose heat to the outside. At a brutal 40-degree feet outside, a reasonable estimate for the total heat loss of the upper envelope, the walls and ceiling, would be around 900 BTUs per hour. The numbers told the whole story. Heat gain from the barn below, approximately 960 BTU/HR. Heat loss to the air outside, approximately 900 BTU/HR. The system was in near-perfect equilibrium. The constant, gentle heat from the animals was enough to almost perfectly offset the heat being lost to the brutal cold. The small cook stove would only be needed for cooking and for a bit of supplemental heat on the absolute coldest days. The house was, in effect, self-heating. The winter arrived not as a guest, but as an invading army. It came in mid-December, a polar vortex that clamped down on the upper Midwest and refused to let go. For 14 consecutive nights, the spirit thermometers across Otter Tail County registered temperatures at or below 40 degrees below zero. The air was so cold it felt solid, a physical weight on the lungs. A profound, unnatural stillness settled over the land. Tin roofs on barns and sheds grew a fantastical, 4-inch thick coating of crystalline hoarfrost. When men lit their kerosene lanterns, the flames burned with a strange, weak blue color, the cold air starving them of a proper draft. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a time of siege. At the stone residence, the battle was constant. Jedediah and his wife took turns feeding the stove, their woodpile shrinking at a terrifying rate. The cabin was a landscape of extreme temperature gradients. 3 feet from the roaring stove, it was barely 50 degrees. 10 feet away, in the corners of the room, the temperature was below freezing. Water in the bucket they kept for drinking, just a few feet from the fire, grew a skin of ice overnight. The family lived in a miserable huddle, wrapped in blankets, their faces flushed from the stove's heat while a permanent chill clung to their backs. Their world had shrunk to a few square feet of survivable space. At the top of the hill, in Kjelsberg's Folly, life continued with an almost surreal normalcy. Outside Torvald's Trøndelag, it was the same 40 degrees below zero. The same crystalline frost coated the roof. But inside the upper quarters, a thermometer hanging on the wall showed a steady, unbelievable 68 degrees. The proof of this success was not in the thermometer, but in a simple crock sitting on a floor-level shelf. It was a crock of Ingrid's rømmegrøt, a rich, traditional porridge made from sour cream, flour, and butter, which she was preparing for the coming julaften, Christmas Eve. In any other house in the county, a dairy product left in a cold corner would have separated, soured, or frozen solid within hours. The cream on Jedediah Stone's porch had split into a curdled, icy mess, but Ingrid's rømmegrøt remained perfectly smooth, thick, and creamy. The gentle, constant warmth rising from the floorboards kept it at a perfect ambient temperature. It was a small, domestic miracle. The children, Lars and Sophia, played on the floor in their shirt sleeves, the warm planks their playground. The air was still and quiet, free of the drafts that plagued the stone cabin. There was no desperate roar from a stove, only the gentle hum of a family living, not just surviving. Emmett Randstad hated winters like this. They were killers, not just of men, but of livestock and livelihoods. His job as dairy inspector became a grim circuit of triage, checking on herds, offering what advice he could, and documenting the losses. The cold was relentless, and it was breaking everything. He was on his way back from a farm near Pelican Lake when it happened. As his sleigh crossed a small frozen culvert about a half-mile from the Kjelsberg place, there was a sharp, metallic crack that echoed in the crystalline air. The sleigh lurched violently to one side. He climbed down, his breath pluming. The right runner, a thick band of forged steel, had snapped in two. The metal, made brittle as a carrot by the sustained, intense cold, had simply given up. He was stranded. His horse stood patiently, its coat covered in a layer of frost. It was at least 5 miles to the nearest smith, and he would freeze long before he walked it. He looked around. His only option was the tall, strange house on the hill, Kjelsberg's Folly. With a sigh of resignation, he began the trudge through the deep, powdery snow. He dreaded what he would find. A family as cold and miserable as every other one he had visited that week, and the awkwardness of having to ask for help from a man he had officially cited. He reached the base of the structure and climbed the sturdy exterior stair to the second-floor door. He knocked, his glove making a dull thud. The door opened, and Torvald Kjelsberg stood there, silhouetted against a soft, warm light. He was wearing a simple wool shirt. Behind him, Randstad could see a woman, Ingrid, stirring something on a small stove, and two small children playing on the wooden floor. No one was wearing a coat. No one was huddled near the fire. But it was the air that struck him first. A gentle, impossibly warm wave of it washed over his frozen face. He had braced himself for the familiar biting chill of a cabin losing its battle with the cold. The acrid smell of a wood stove being pushed to its limit. He expected the damp, clinging cold he had felt in a dozen other homes that day. What he felt instead was a gentle, radiant warmth that seemed to be rising from the very floorboards beneath his frozen boots. The air was still, clean, and utterly, shockingly comfortable. It didn't smell of the barn below, only faintly of baking bread and warm wood. "Mr. Randstad," Torvald said, his voice even, "it is cold for a drive." Randstad, momentarily speechless, stammered out his predicament. "My runner, it snapped, the cold." "Come in," Torvald said simply, stepping aside. Randstad entered, stamping the snow from his boots. He took off his thick fur cap, which was stiff with frozen breath, and placed it on the floor near the door. He watched, mesmerized, as the frost on the fur began to melt instantly, forming a small puddle on the warm plank. He looked at the family, at their simple indoor clothes, at the impossible scene of domestic peace in the heart of a polar vortex. Ingrid handed him a steaming mug of coffee. "Please," she said with a small smile. He took it, his numb fingers fumbling. He walked across the room and held his hand over the floor. It was warm. Not hot, just warm. A deep, pervasive, life-giving warmth. He looked at Torvald, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he knew about building and farming in Minnesota. "How?" Randstad asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Your stove is tiny. How is this possible?" Torvald gestured with his chin towards the floor. "The herd," he said. "They are the stove." Randstad stared at the floor, then at Torvald. The inspector, the man of rules and codes, saw the animal stalls below not as a violation, but as the foundation of a miracle. The citation slip he had written seemed like a fool's errand, a document from another, colder, less intelligent world. He finally understood. The entire structure was a single, living system. The animals provided the heat, the house retained it. It was symbiotic. Perfect. He looked at Torvald, a slow smile of pure, unadulterated awe spreading across his face. "My God, man," Randstad said, shaking his head in wonder. "You didn't build a barn with a house on top. You built a heart with ribs around it." The conversion of Emmett Randstad was quiet, but complete. The citation for the dairy code violation was never filed. It disappeared into a cold file, forgotten. But Randstad did not forget what he had seen. On his rounds, when he encountered struggling farmers, especially fellow Scandinavians, who might be more receptive to an old-world idea, he would tell the story. He wouldn't command or order, he would simply describe. He told them about a house where children played on the floor in their shirt sleeves at 40 below. He told them about a crock of cream porridge that never froze. He told them about the gentle, constant warmth rising from the floor. Word spread through the tight-knit Norwegian-American community. The story of Torvald Kjelsberg's warm house became a legend, whispered about at church socials and in the mercantile. It was a story that offered something more valuable than money, hope. A way to defeat the winter not with brute force and endless fuel, but with intelligence. The tipping point came in March of 1902. The Sønner of Norge, the Sons of Norway Lodge in Fergus Falls, was a cultural and social anchor for the immigrants in the region. The lodge leaders, having heard the persistent rumors, invited Torvald to their monthly meeting to speak about his design. Torvald was not a public speaker. He stood before the 50 assembled men, uncomfortable in his Sunday best. He did not give a grand speech. Instead, he walked to a large chalkboard and with a piece of chalk began to draw. He sketched the two-story structure, marking the dimensions. He drew the heavy joists, the thick plank floor, the interior staircase. He drew the stalls for the cows and horses below. He didn't use fancy terms like BTUs or thermal conductivity. He spoke in the simple, practical language of a builder. "The herd makes heat," he explained, pointing to the lower level. "All day, all night, the heat wants to go up. The floor is thick, but the warmth comes through slow, gentle. It warms the floor. The warm floor warms the house." He paused, looking at the faces of the men, farmers, and laborers who understood the brutal calculus of winter. You do not have to burn so much wood. You let the animals help you. The men were silent, studying the drawing. It was so simple, yet so radical. It inverted everything they thought they knew about a proper farmstead. After the meeting, they crowded around him asking questions. He answered them patiently, explaining the need for good ventilation in the barn, the importance of the thick, tight floor. The lodge was convinced. In their next newsletter, a publication read by hundreds of Norwegian families across Otter Tail and the neighboring counties, they printed Torvald's plan. It was a simple, one-page diagram with notes translated into both Norwegian and English. The adoption was immediate. That spring and summer, the sound of hammers echoed a new tune across the cutover. By the time the next winter arrived, 9 families from the shores of Wall Lake in Otter Tail to the flat plains of Wilkin County had built their own variations of the Trønder lawn. The idea, planted by one man's memory and proven in the crucible of a polar vortex, had taken root. Torvald Kjelsberg's Trønder lawn was more than just a clever piece of folk architecture. It was a century ahead of its time. Without a formal education in thermodynamics, he had created a near-perfect passive heat recovery system. Modern building science would later give formal names to the principles he employed. The barn, with its population of livestock and its deep bedding of hay and manure, was a bioreactor. The slow composting of the hay and waste in the bedding generated its own gentle supplemental heat, a process modern engineers call exothermic decomposition. The 2-inch plank floor, which his neighbors had mocked, was functioning as a massive, low-temperature radiant panel. This concept, using large, warm surfaces to heat a space, is now considered one of the most comfortable and efficient forms of heating, prized in high-end modern construction. Instead of heating the air, it heats the objects and people in the room directly with gentle infrared radiation. The entire structure was an exercise in what is now called passive house design, a rigorous standard for energy efficiency that focuses on creating a super-insulated, airtight envelope to minimize heat loss. Torvald's living quarters, small and compact, sitting atop a massive thermal battery, was a brilliant execution of this core principle. He had intuitively understood that it's easier to keep a small, well-insulated space warm than a large leaky one. The system even mirrored the function of a modern heat recovery ventilator, HRV, which uses the heat from outgoing stale air to warm up incoming fresh air. In Torvald's design, the waste heat of the animals was recovered and used to warm the living space. He had built a living machine. The story of Torvald Kjelsberg is a quiet lesson, written in timber and frost. On the American frontier, progress was often seen as a process of separation, of separating man from nature, the clean from the unclean, the house from the barn. The ideal was a tidy farmhouse painted white, standing apart from the muck and mire of the animal world. It was a vision of domestic purity, but one that came at a terrible cost in fuel, comfort, and labor. Torvald's genius was not in engineering a better furnace, but in challenging this fundamental idea of separation. He came from a tradition where the boundary between the human and animal worlds was more permeable, a partnership born of necessity. His design was a statement of symbiosis. He didn't heat the cabin from below with a stove, a dead thing that consumed fuel and gave back only smoke and ash. He asked the living herd to breathe warmth up through the boards. It was a profound act of trust and cooperation. The animals, sheltered from the killing wind and cold in their warm furs, gave back a portion of their life force, their constant metabolic fire, to the family that sheltered above them. It was a closed loop of warmth and security, a silent agreement between man and beast, written against the cold. In a land that celebrated rugged individualism, Torvald Kjelsberg built a monument to quiet cohabitation. He knew that the deepest warmth didn't come from a fire you built, but from the life you nurtured. If you found this story of quiet ingenuity and forgotten wisdom inspiring, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales of historical innovation. We believe the past has lessons for the present, and we're dedicated to uncovering them. We have a question for you. What other old-world technologies or building methods do you think could solve modern problems? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. While the techniques and principles are based on real historical practices, the specific characters, names, and sequence of events depicted are fictional. Any application of historical building methods in a modern context should be done in consultation with qualified professionals and in accordance with all current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.